Now for the third part of this mini-series, we're going back now to discuss even more dirt and drama. This time around, we'll be covering several more teams that have a good skeleton or two in their closet. Keep in mind though, that unfortunately a couple of teams had to be left out because there just wasn't anything substantial enough to include. Anyways, if you're new here, I'd love for you to give this channel a chance and to subscribe. And with that, here is part 3 of the NHL's biggest scandals from each team to date. The 2011 NHL entry draft was expected to be not as exciting as the previous expansion draft in Seattle was. For one, the event was again strictly televised and not in person, and secondly, there wasn't any players who carried the hype of, say, a Connor McDavid, Austin Matthews, or even Jack Hughes. Therefore, as many focused their attention on the event itself, well, the main takeaway from day one of the draft wasn't pure excitement, but instead pure shock. Yes, as believe it or not, former GM Marc Bergevin did the unthinkable and drafted a player 31st overall that didn't want to be drafted in the first place. As we saw with Mitchell Miller previously, who carried a cloud of controversy with him to the desert. Logan Mailloux had his own troubled past as well, as Mailloux previously, during his time playing overseas in Sweden, was fined around what would be $1,000 for invasion of privacy and defamation, after he decided that it was a good idea to send out an inappropriate picture of a girl he had intimate relations with. Therefore, in an attempt to exercise remorse and to own up to what he had done, Mailloux renounced himself from the draft. But unfortunately for him, Marc Bergevin and the Montreal Canadiens didn't exactly respect his wishes, as Mailloux was still technically eligible to be selected regardless. This of course sent shockwaves of disgust and confusion throughout the hockey community, and even prompted the team to make a formal statement assuring that the defenseman would be completely barred from the season's training camp, and also caused Mailloux to release his own apology video, in which he referred to his actions as stupid and egotistical. Regardless, Mailloux did get his first shot at NHL action last season, and has still remained within Montreal's system ever since. It really doesn't seem like it was that long ago that Team Canada defeated Sweden and took home the gold in result. And at that time, the most controversy had to do with the fact that Elias Anderson, who was on the losing side, decided to toss his silver medal into the unsuspecting crowd in Buffalo. But as the players celebrated, no one could have fathomed the sinister events that had taken place behind closed doors. And what would take years to uncover would lead investigators down a road of troublesome happenings. Now, it's important to note that according to the alleged victim, who is going by the initials EM, nothing related to the case transpired until June of 2018. Regardless, the team was reunited at the Team Canada Gala and golf event, according to an article from ESPN, which I'll link down below. After having a team dinner on the 17th, the main event on the agenda was the gala. Afterwards, the players migrated over to Jack's, which is a bar whose clientele is typically college-age students. It was at Jack's where EM met one of the players, and she proceeded to partake in some alcoholic beverages. After becoming pretty intoxicated, she recalls that she and the player had a sexual encounter in his hotel room. All this was consensual from the victim's account. What came later was not. In summary, the player that EM said she became intimate with invited several of his teammates into the room where she was, and from there, things began to get increasingly dark. Since I'm keeping this one PG, you can check out the article I mentioned for more details. But after being made to do some things that she didn't want to do, EM reportedly was coerced into making a video where she stated that everything was consensual. Following the horrific ordeal, EM then notified her then stepfather the next day, who then called Hockey Canada's Human Resources Department and reported what happened. A couple years later, it was then revealed that EM was seeking a settlement from Hockey Canada in the form of $3.55 million in damages. In May of 2022, Team Canada was able to reach a settlement that met the victim's demands. However, this doesn't mean that the players involved are off the hook. Not just yet. As it stands, Carter Hart, Dylan Dubé, Michael McLeod, Kyle Foote, and Alex Formanton were all charged in connection with the case. The only comments that have been made from the NHL and NHLPA is that the players involved have been granted an indefinite leave of absence. Alright guys, the NHL season is upon us and you know what that means. It's time to stock up on all of your favorite teams' merch. And that's where Fanatics comes in. Since they're the ones producing NHL jerseys for the time being, if you're planning to buy one or other Fanatics products, you can support me by simply using my link. Once the Fanatics site appears, you can make your purchase just like you would originally. My link will be down in the description for those who are interested. And now, back to the video. Now, in case you didn't think that the Team Canada case wasn't catastrophic enough, John Spano says, "Hold my beer." Back in the late 90s, the New York Islanders were struggling to remain relevant. After the glory days of the 80s, in which the team won 4 consecutive championships, the Islanders were facing hard times to say the least. By the time the 97-98 season concluded, the team ended up missing the playoffs for the 4th time in a row. And as is usually the case where there are struggles in the NHL world, there would also be changes as well. In this case, one of the biggest changes was the ownership. John Pickett, who was the owner during the team's glory days, had decided to relinquish his hold on the team and to put it on the market. The most promising suitor, at least to start, was businessman John Spano. Spano, who previously tried to purchase a portion of the Dallas Stars and Florida Panthers, was set on the principle that the third try would be the charm. After graduating from Duquesne University with a degree in business administration, Spano founded the Bison Group, a company that primarily leased aircraft. As Spano applied for ownership of the team, he had come equipped with a slew of documents that indicated that he was worth millions of dollars. Faced with this and the evidence that he had previously inquired about buying 2 other NHL teams, the league wasted no time in approving his proposal. Spano bought the Islanders for over $165 million. He was initially able to obtain $80 million of it by taking out bank loans. However, after Spano failed to produce $5 million for the down payment, is when questions started being asked, pertaining to his legitimacy and intent. Eventually, NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman forced Spano to give the control back to its former owner. Unfortunately for Spano, though, this was only the first of the humiliation that he had to endure. After a thorough FBI investigation, Spano realized that he was in over his head and pled guilty to forgery and theft, granting him close to a 7-year stay in federal prison. The New York native was also made to pay $11.9 million in restitution to the banks, team owners, and everyone else that he had conned. Following his release from prison, Spano continued to commit fraud and has been in and out of prison. His latest bout of forgery, which he was charged for 16 counts of it, landed him in Grafton Correctional Institution in Ohio. His scheduled release date is in November of this year. Since we're going to cover the most recent gambling incident to take place in hockey, I thought it was only fitting to talk about the first. Back in 1948, the NHL was a completely different league than it is today. For starters, the original 6 were the only teams that had been established. This made for an extremely short postseason, one in which there were only 2 rounds. However, before Toronto would go on to defeat Detroit that postseason, there was a scandal that quickly grabbed everyone's attention, as NHL Commissioner at the time, Clarence Campbell, had uncovered some nefarious activities that were taking place away from play, indirectly at least. On March 8th of 48, former teammates Billy Taylor and Don Gallinger were suspended initially for life due to betting on games within their own league. At the time of the incident, Gallinger had been traded from Boston to the New York Rangers, but only had a chance to play 2 games formally for the Blue Shirts. Reason being, this had come on the heels of another similar incident involving Toronto's own Babe Pratt, who had been suspended for involvement in a gambling ring that had its roots in Toronto. Pratt was dealt a 9-game suspension for betting on his own team. Therefore, by the time the next incident surfaced, Campbell knew that he had needed to make a statement that enough was enough. Now, it's important to note that this string of gambling activities could be traced back to Detroit criminal and gambler James Tamer. Tamer had been the middleman and placed bets for the penalized players. Taylor specifically admitted to gambling on a game he was in fact participating in. However, after betting against his own team humorously, the forward wasn't happy when his team actually won because, ironically, this means, in that case, he lost. Even though Taylor and Gallagher played their last game in March of '48, they were officially reinstated by the league in 1970. If you've been watching hockey or sports in general long enough, then you'll know that in recent times, gambling ads have taken over sports. During NHL games, it's completely typical to see them plastered on the boards, ice, jerseys, jumbotron, basically anywhere that spectating eyes will land. And even though there was suspicion that Evander Kane was gambling on his games before, there hadn't been until last year a player penalized for a gambling-related incident in the modern era. On October 26th of last year, some startling news sent shockwaves through the hockey community. Ottawa's own Shane Pinto was reprimanded for, quote, activities related to sports wagering, end quote. His suspension was the steepest that the league had seen in several years. While there were those few that notoriously were banned from the NHL entirely, as far as suspension game lengths, Pinto's 41 games put him in interesting company, as the last player to have been suspended for half of the season was headhunter Rappy Torres. If you're interested in learning more about his career and the suspension specifically, be sure to check out a previous video of mine on the longest suspensions in history. Anyways, according to Pinto, the steep punishment took him by surprise. Definitely I was caught off guard a bit. It just kind of came out of nowhere and went from there, Pinto said. Even though the details of the incident were kept in-house, what we do know is that he violated the league's gambling policies in some way. Regardless, Pinto, after re-signing with the Senators, was able to return to play on January 21st of this year. Sadly, we as a community had to recently bid farewell to Johnny Gaudreau. And while I know my previous videos haven't directly mentioned his passing, I wanted to give Johnny Hockey an official nod in transition to this topic. While Gaudreau's passing didn't happen on the ice surface, Adam Johnson's kinda did. Shortly after the Pittsburgh Penguins captured their second cup in a row, Johnson, who was undrafted, earned a contract with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Johnson, who had taken the college route to the NHL, ended up competing in 13 games for the Pens. After not being able to find a place in the lineup, the forward spent a considerable amount of time moving from one team to the next. Eventually, though, Johnson found himself overseas in 2023 and playing for the Nottingham Panthers. On October 28th, while facing the Sheffield Steelers, the Panthers team was dealt a horrific tragedy. While Johnson had puck possession in the offensive zone, an opposing player who would soon be in the spotlight raised his leg and made a kicking motion with his skate blade, as the blade made contact and unfortunately cut into Johnson's throat. While we're not going to show the actual footage in this video, I will have a link to it down below if you want to see. After he received the laceration, Johnson, who tried to initially make his way off ice by himself, ended up collapsing before he could. As spectators who were asked to leave the game prematurely were exiting the arena, Johnson was being taken to Sheffield's Northern General Hospital. Unfortunately, Johnson was deceased by the time he arrived. Just as the hockey world was mourning the tragedy, the South Yorkshire Police were preparing to open an investigation, and there's no doubt that it began with questioning Matt Petgrave. Petgrave was a Steelers player that had managed to end his opponent's life, and it didn't take long for local authorities to take action, as Petgrave was arrested on the suspicion of manslaughter 17 days after Johnson's sudden passing. While many, including Petgrave's teammates, have dubbed this a freak accident, there are mixed opinions on the intent when Johnson was struck. Regardless, this turn of events is what caused the EIHL to make neck guards a mandatory piece of equipment for all players in the league. Since the investigation is still underway, Petgrave's bail has been extended until November of this year.
Johnny, here we go. Talk us through it, Johnny, where you're going here.
All right, let's see it.